What if Jon Snow fought in the Battle of Tumbleton alongside Daemon Targaryen? The snow fell in the far reaches of the north, the way it had fallen for 10,000 years, without haste and without mercy, drifting down through a world of white and gray and the deep green of sentinel pines that stood like patient sentries at the edge of the known world. Beyond the great ice wall that men had raised in ages long forgotten, the land stretched wild and silent, broken only by the crunch of leather boots upon frozen ground and the soft, panting breath of a white direwolf who moved through the drifts like a ghost given fur and shape. Jon Snow walked at the head of a small ranging party, his black cloak heavy with frost, his breath rising in pale clouds that vanished almost as soon as they were born, and his eyes fixed upon the fleeing figure who scrambled ahead of them through the trees. The wildling raider they pursued was quick and desperate, a man who knew this country the way Jon knew the corridors of Castle Black, and he led them deeper into a grove of weirwoods that none of the rangers had marked upon any map. The pale trunks rose all around them, their bark the color of old bone, their carved faces weeping crimson sap that looked in the failing light like blood frozen upon ancient wood. Ghost slowed and pressed close to Jon's side, and a low sound rose from the wolf's throat, a warning that Jon had learned never to ignore, though in that moment his attention was bent entirely upon the man he chased and the strange stillness that seemed to gather in the air. The wildling stumbled at the foot of the greatest weirwood in the grove, where the roots split apart in a fracture that plunged down into darkness, and it was there, at the very heart of that silent place, that the world changed. A mist rose from the broken roots, green as spring leaves yet cold as the void between stars, and it curled upward with a slowness that seemed almost deliberate, almost aware. Jon called out to his brothers, but the words were swallowed before they left his lips, and the mist wrapped around him like a living thing, and the grove and the snow and the sound of ghosts' frantic barking all fell away into nothing at all. When Jon woke, he lay upon warm earth beneath a sky he did not recognize, and the air smelled of green growing things and river water, and none of the sharp, clean cold he had known his whole life. His cloak was soaked through, though whether by melted snow or river damp he could not say, and his sword lay near his hand where it had fallen, and Ghost was nowhere to be found, and the loss of him would gnaw at Jon through every day that followed, a phantom ache he carried into a strange new war. He rose slowly, his head heavy, and his thoughts scattered like startled birds, and he looked upon a landscape of rolling hills and gentle woods, and a broad, slow river winding through it all, and he understood that he was no longer in the north, no longer perhaps in any place he had ever walked. He wandered until the light began to fade, and it was near a modest farmstead that he found the first living souls he had seen since waking, a family of Riverland's small folk who shrank from him in fear at the sight of his black cloak and the steel at his hip. A gaunt woman clutched 2 children behind her skirts, while a man with a hoe held his ground with trembling hands, and it was only Jon's careful words and his open palms that kept them from fleeing altogether. He asked them where he was, and they told him he stood upon the banks of the Mander, and when he asked what year it was, they looked at him as though he were mad or fevered, and spoke instead of the war that had swallowed the realm whole. They spoke of 2 dragons at war with one another, of a queen who claimed the Iron Throne, and a king who denied her, of a great house of dragon lords divided against itself, and drowning the kingdoms in fire and blood. Jon listened, and something cold settled into his chest that had nothing to do with the north he had left behind, for the names they spoke were names from histories and songs, names of the dead who had ruled centuries before whenever he drew breath. He did not tell them what he suspected, for he scarcely believed it himself, and there seemed no words in any tongue to explain the truth that was slowly closing around him like the green mist that had swallowed him whole. He shared their meager supper of barley and turnip and slept that night in their barn upon a bed of old straw, and in the darkness he lay awake and turned the impossible over and over in his mind, seeking any explanation that did not require him to believe he had fallen backward through the years into an age of dragons and dead kings. Yet no other answer came, and by the gray light of morning he had resolved that whatever had befallen him, he could not solve it lying idle in a stranger's barn, hungry and lost, and mourning the companions he might never see again. The family told him, when he pressed them, that armies were gathering to the west, that a great host was said to be mustering near a town called Tumbleton, and that men who could fight were being fed and sheltered and paid in the coin of whichever side would have them. Jon knew nothing of the quarrels of these long-dead dragons and cared less for their throne, but he knew the weight of a sword in his hand and the discipline of men marching together, and he knew that a soldier who could fight would find bread and answers alike where the armies gathered. He gathered his cloak about him, thanked the frightened family, and set his face toward the distant sound of horns. The road to Tumbleton was not truly a road at all by the time Jon reached its final miles, for the passage of thousands of feet and hooves and wagon wheels had churned the earth into a black ribbon of mud that clung to his boots and slowed his steps. He walked with his hood drawn low against a thin drizzle that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall from it, and as he crested a low rise, the whole of the high-tower host spread before him like some vast, sprawling beast that had lain down upon the land and refused to move again. Tents beyond counting stood in ragged clusters, and beyond them, low against the pewter sky, the smoke of the burning town rose in slow, lazy columns that bent and drifted with no wind to guide them. The smell reached him before the sound did, and it was a smell he knew too well from the aftermath of battles he had fought in another life entirely, the stench of char and blood and spoiled meat, and the particular sourness of fear that seems to soak into the ground itself. As he descended toward the camp, the sounds gathered around him, the low murmur of a defeated place pretending at celebration, laughter that curdled into something ugly at its edges, the distant crash of timber, and beneath it all, the thin, ceaseless weeping of those who had lost everything and had not yet found the strength to stop. Camp followers moved among the tents like ghosts, and it was from their frightened talk that Jon began to understand the shape of what had happened here. He caught the words in fragments as he passed, gathered them the way a man gathers kindling in the dark, and pieced them into a grim picture. Two men, they said, two dragon seeds who had once ridden beneath Queen Rhaenyra's banner, had turned their cloaks in the very midst of the fighting and loosed their dragons upon the queen's own men. Ulf the White they named one, a great drunken lump of a man who spent his days now sprawled in the finest house left standing, and Hugh Hammer the other, a bastard smith's son grown vast and hungry with the taste of power. Together with the young Prince Daemon, they had broken the town and given it over to sack, and now they held Tumbleton in a reign that the small folk spoke of only in whispers, as though naming it aloud might draw its eye toward them. Jon had seen the aftermath of cruelty before, but he had never grown a callus thick enough to walk past it unmoved, and so when he heard the sound from behind a leaning wagon, the choked cry and the coarse laughter of men who felt no fear of consequence, his hand had found the hilt of his sword before his mind had fully framed the decision. 3 soldiers had a village girl pressed against the wheel, and their faces, when they turned toward him, held only the lazy irritation of men interrupted at sport, rather than any flicker of alarm. That was their mistake, and it was the last one two of them would make. Jon moved through them with the economy of a man who had spent his youth learning that hesitation was a kind of death. And when it was finished, two of the soldiers lay in the mud, and the third had fled shouting into the maze of tents, and the girl was already gone, vanished into whatever hole she had crawled from. He expected the shouting to bring the whole camp down upon him, but the chaos of the place swallowed the disturbance whole, and instead of a mob, he drew only the attention of a pair of hedge knights who had watched the whole affair from beneath a sagging canopy where they nursed cups of sour wine. They regarded him with the frank appraisal that fighting men give to other fighting men, and one of them, a scarred fellow with a broken nose, spat into the mud and remarked that he had not seen a blade handled so cleanly since Rook's Rest. They took him for a sellsword, and in the ruin of that army, where no man knew half the faces around him, and captains had died in droves during the sack, no one thought to question a stranger who could fight, nor to report the deaths of two men whose absence would trouble no muster roll that anyone would ever read. So Jon sat with them a while, and shared their wine that he did not drink, and listened. It was in that hour that he came to understand the truth of the host he had wandered into. For the talk among these men was not the talk of soldiers loyal to a cause, but of men who had begun to smell rot in the ranks above them. Hugh Hammer, they muttered, had grown too grand by half, had taken to wearing a crown of hammered iron, and speaking of ancient prophecies that named a bastard born to rule. And the true-born knights of the Hightower banners did not mean to bleed and die so that a smith's whelp might set himself above them. There was hatred in the way they spoke his name, and fear too, and Jon recognized with a cold certainty that he had walked not into an army, but into a snake pit, a coiling nest of rival loyalties, where every man watched his neighbor, and no oath held longer than the next cup of wine. He wanted no part of it, and as the drizzle thickened into proper rain, and the two knights fell to arguing between themselves, Jon turned the matter over in his mind. The small folk spoke of another side, of a queen whose men had been the ones burned and broken here, and it seemed to him that whatever cause opposed the men who had done this thing was the only cause worth the reaching. He resolved then to slip away north before the night was through, and he began, quietly, to mark the pickets and count the fires. He waited until the fires had burned to sullen embers, and the last of the sentries had drawn their cloaks close against the rain, and then he moved, as he had been taught to move, in the wolf's wood of his boyhood, low and slow and patient, his boots finding the soft places in the earth where his passage would leave no sound. The rain served him well, drumming steadily against the ruined thatch and the trampled fields, so that the small noises a man made in the dark were swallowed whole. And by the hour, the sky went from black to the deep, bruised gray that came before dawn. He had put the smoking ruin of the town well behind him and was walking north beneath a canopy of dripping trees, with no company but his own breath and the steady weight of his sword against his hip. He learned quickly that daylight was his enemy in this land, for twice in that first gray morning he glimpsed riders on the roads, men in good mail-bearing devices he did not know, and each time he sank into the brush and the bracken and waited with the stillness of a hunter until the sound of hooves had faded. So he took to walking by night and sleeping by day in whatever hollow or thicket offered cover, moving always toward the smell of wood smoke and the promise of shelter, until on the third such night he came upon a village that had not been burned, a scattering of low houses and a modest sept and a holdfast of dark stone, where the folk still spoke the name of their queen with something like love rather than dread. They took him for a wandering sellsword, which was near enough to true, and fed him barley bread and a thin stew of roots, and gave him a place by the fire in the holdfast's hall. And it was there that an old maester found him, a stooped and gentle man, with a chain of many metals hanging heavy about his neck, and eyes gone milky at the edges with age. The maester, whose name was Balin, listened with growing wonder to the questions Jon put to him, for they were the questions of a man who knew nothing at all, and rather than mock him for his ignorance, he seemed glad of the chance to teach, drawing his stool close and folding his spotted hands upon his knees as the fire snapped and hissed between them. He told Jon of the old king, Viserys, dead these many months, and of how the king had named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir before all the lords of the realm, and how that word had been broken the moment the breath left his body, for the queen and her allies had crowned the king's eldest son Aegon instead, and set the daughter aside. He spoke of the war that followed, the war men had begun to call the Dance of the Dragons, and of how it had gone back and forth like a tide, with dragons falling burning from the sky, and princes dying in ways too terrible to name. He told of the deaths of Aegon's own children, of little Jaehaerys murdered in his bed as a debt paid for a slain prince, and of the boy king Aegon himself grievously wounded and hidden away, so that no man rightly knew whether the Greens were ruled by a king or by his mother the Queen Dowager, or by no one at all. Jon sat very still through all of this, the stew cooling forgotten in his hands, and he felt the strange and dizzying knowledge settle over him that these silver-haired warriors dying in their thousands were his own distant blood, that the throne, being fought over across 100 leagues, was one to which his own hidden lineage bound him by threads he did not fully understand. He said nothing of that. He said only that he was northern-born, a fighter come south seeking honorable service, and though the maester looked at him a long moment with those clouded, knowing eyes, he did not press. There were vows Jon had sworn that he would not break for any comfort or any prize, and there was a name he carried that he would not speak aloud in a hall full of strangers, and so he kept the black cloak of the watch and the wolf of his father folded away in the silence of his own heart. "The queen's cause bleeds," Balin said quietly, poking at the fire so that a spray of sparks rose and died. "There was a battle at a town called Tumbleton, not far from where you say you walked. 2 of her own men, dragonriders sworn to her, turned their cloaks in the very hour of triumph and burned her army where it stood. It was a black betrayal, and it has left her wanting swords more sorely than ever she wanted them before." He glanced up, the firelight catching in the wet shine of his eyes. If a man sought honorable service, and cared for whose banner he raised his blade beneath, he might do worse than to seek out the queen's men who yet hold the field. "And where," Jon asked, "would such men be found?" "Harrenhal," the maester said, and the word fell heavy in the smoky air. "Prince Daemon holds it for the queen, her husband and her uncle, and perhaps the fiercest sword House Targaryen has known in living memory. He waits there upon his dragon and gathers what strength he can. If it is a righteous cause you want, boy, you will find no purer fire in all the realm than the one that burns in Daemon Targaryen." Jon looked long into the flames, thinking of the burned town and the men who had made it, and knew that his road ran north and east now, toward a castle of black stone and a prince he had never seen. The morning that Jon set out from the ruined hamlet was pale and cold, the light filtering weakly through a haze of smoke that still lingered on the eastern horizon, and the road before him was crowded with the broken remnants of a country undone. They came in ones and twos at first, then in ragged clusters, men and women and children driven from their homes by the burning of Tumbleton, their faces gaunt with hunger and their eyes hollowed by the particular grief of those who have lost everything they knew. Some carried bundles of possessions wrapped in cloth, others carried nothing at all, and all of them moved with the shuffling gait of people who no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet. Jon walked among them without meaning to lead, and yet within a day the quiet certainty in his bearing had drawn them to him, as iron shavings are drawn toward a lodestone. He did not announce himself, nor promise them anything, but when the food he carried was shared out among the smallest of the children, without a word of complaint, and when he took the watch through the coldest hours of the night while others slept, they began to look to him for the shape of each day. It was the old habit of the wall, the discipline bred into him through long dark years of standing sentinel over frozen ground, and it settled upon these frightened people like a mantle. He taught them to march in a column rather than a rabble, to keep the weak in the center and the able-bodied at the flanks, to move at dawn and rest before the light failed, so that no camp was made in darkness. The order steadied them, and the steadiness gave them something to hold to, and slowly the fear in their eyes gave way to a wary, tentative hope. On the third day the scouts found them. They were green men, riders in the service of the boy king's cause, 3 of them mounted and armored, and hungry for whatever plunder a column of refugees might yield. And they came upon Jon's people, where the road narrowed between 2 wooded slopes. Jon saw them before they saw him, and he did not shout or panic, but drew his people quietly into the trees, whispering his instructions with a calm that spread outward through the column like still water. He waited. He let the riders come into the throat of the defile, where the branches hung low and the horses could not turn, and only then did he move, and the ambush was swift and cold and terrible in its efficiency. When it was over, 2 of the green men lay dead among the leaves, and the third had fled, and Jon stood breathing slowly with the dark blade of his sword, catching the filtered light, feeling nothing that resembled triumph, only the grim knowledge that such things must sometimes be done. It was then that the man called Wat came to him. He was a broad, weathered fellow, a man-at-arms who had lost his lord and his purpose in the burning, and he knelt in the wet leaves before Jon, with his head bowed, and swore in a rough and unpolished voice to follow him wherever his road might lead. Jon told him he could offer no lands and no gold, that he was himself a stranger, with nothing to his name but a sword and a wolf, and Wat only nodded, and said that he had followed lords with lands and lords with gold, and both had died in the fire, and that he would rather follow a man who knew how to keep the living breathing. And so Jon gained his first sworn companion in this strange age, a man who would fight at his side through Tumbleton and after, unwavering to the end, and the 2 of them walked at the head of the column, while the sun climbed and fell, and the road wound ever northward toward the black towers on the horizon. They came within sight of Harrenhal on the 5th day, and the sight of it stopped Jon in his tracks. The great castle rose against the gray sky, like the corpse of some ancient beast, its 5 vast towers twisted and melted by dragonfire long ago, its walls the color of old ash, and above it, wheeling in slow and patient circles, moved a shape that Jon knew at once, even though he had never truly seen its like. The dragon was blood-dark against the clouds, its wings vast and unhurried, and as it turned, some cold and half-forgotten thing stirred in Jon's chest, a pull of recognition that he could not name, and a dread that came with it, as though a door had opened somewhere in the deep places of his blood. That night, sitting apart from the others with Wat beside a low fire, Jon found himself speaking of a grief he had carried across the length of a world he no longer understood. He spoke of brothers he had loved and lost, of faces he could no longer summon clearly, in a life that felt further away with every passing day no matter how he reached for it, and the ache of it was raw in his voice. Wat listened in silence, and when Jon had finished, he laid a hand upon his shoulder and told him gently that the death of a brother was the hardest wound a man could carry, and that time would dull its edge if never quite heal it. Jon did not correct him, for he could not have explained the truth even to himself, and he let the man believe what comfort he could. Then Wat looked toward the burned towers and the dragons circling above them, and he spoke with quiet certainty. That rider, he said, could be no other than Prince Daemon himself, the fiercest sword in all the realm, and if Jon meant to seek him out, he had best be ready for what such a man would ask of him. The road to Harrenhal was long, and the castle grew no less monstrous as Jon approached it, its 5 great towers looming against a bruised sky, like the fingers of some drowned giant clawing up from beneath the earth. He had bid Wat wait with the refugees at the crossroads, unwilling to lead his first sworn man into a lord's hall unbidden, with a quiet word of thanks and a promise he was not certain he could keep, and he had walked the last miles alone, knowing the prince's men would not lightly admit a stranger, and prepared to prove his worth, or be turned away with a blade at his back, and the memory of that circling dragon burned behind his eyes. The gates of the castle stood open but well guarded, and the men who held them wore the boiled leather and mismatched mail of soldiers who had seen hard fighting and expected more, and they looked upon the grim northern stranger with the flat suspicion of men who had learned to trust nothing that came walking out of the dark. They asked his business, and he told them plainly that he had come to fight, and one of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a scar splitting his lip, laughed and said the prince had no want of beggars pretending to be swords. Jon did not rise to the mockery. He only said that if the man doubted his steel, he was welcome to test it, and something in the quiet flatness of the words, the utter absence of boast or bluster, made the laughter die in the sergeant's throat. There was a small yard within the gate where sacks of grain were stacked, and there, in the failing light, the sergeant drew his blade and bade Jon prove himself, expecting to teach the Northmen a swift and humbling lesson. What followed was over almost before it began. Jon moved as he had been trained to move upon the ice-slick walls of a wall no man here had ever seen, economical and merciless, and where the sergeant swung with the heavy confidence of a strong man used to overpowering weaker ones. Jon simply was not where the blow landed. He turned the stroke aside with a scrape of steel, stepped inside the man's reach, and set the edge of his sword against the sergeant's throat before the fellow had even understood that he had lost. For a long moment, the two of them stood frozen in the deepening dusk, the only sound the ragged breathing of the disarmed man and the distant lowing of a dragon somewhere beyond the towers. And then Jon lowered his blade and stepped back without a word of triumph. The other guards had fallen silent. The sergeant rubbed his throat, looked at the young man with new and wary eyes, and said that perhaps the prince ought to see this one after all. So it was that Jon Snow was brought through the cavernous bowels of Harrenhal, past halls so vast that torchlight could not reach their ceilings and hearths large enough to roast an ox whole, into the presence of the man they called the Rogue Prince. Daemon Targaryen sat at the head of a long table strewn with maps and cups and the guttering stubs of candles, and he did not rise when Jon entered, but he looked up, and his pale violet eyes fixed upon the stranger with an intensity that few men could have met without flinching. He was older than the songs would one day make him, his silver hair streaked with gray, and his face lined with the labor of a war he had fought for years. Yet there was in him still the coiled and dangerous grace of a man who had never in his life been afraid of anything, and he studied Jon the way a swordsmith studies a length of unfamiliar metal, weighing it, wondering what it might become. He asked the Northman who he was and whence he came, and Jon gave him the truth as far as he dared to give it, saying that he was a man of the north come south to fight the men who had burned Tumbleton, and Daemon marked the careful spaces in the answer, the things left unsaid, but he did not press them yet. Instead, he asked why a stranger should care what became of a town he had never seen. And here, Jon did not dissemble, for the memory of the smoke and the corpses in the fields was fresh and hot within him, and he spoke of what had been done there, the murdered small folk and the ravaged homes, with a plain and honest fury that seemed to catch the prince by surprise. Daemon leaned back in his great carved chair, and a slow and curious smile touched the corner of his mouth, and he said that most men who came seeking coin did not trouble themselves to hate the enemy with such conviction. They spoke then of the war, or rather Daemon spoke and Jon listened, learning of the prince's design to gather the scattered strength of the river lords and to fall upon the men who had taken Tumbleton before they could fortify their gains. And then Daemon did a thing that surprised the men standing about the hall, for he turned to this unproven stranger and bade him speak his mind upon the matter, plainly and without flattery, as a test of what manner of man he was. Jon considered the maps a long moment, and then he told the prince that dragons won battles but they did not win wars, that a beast could burn an army but could not hold a road nor guard a ford, nor keep frightened men from breaking, and that if the prince meant to retake the ground he had lost, he would need discipline and knowledge of the land, far more than he needed fire from the sky. A silence fell, and Daemon Targaryen looked upon the severe young Northman with something that was very close to respect, and he said, softly, that perhaps he had been sent something better than a sellsword. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither man had expected to find agreeable, and the great blackened shell of Harrenhal, that ruin of a castle too vast for any garrison to fill, became for a little while the meeting ground of two men who had come from opposite ends of the world and found in each other something they had not thought to seek. Each morning the frost lay thin upon the flagstones of the yard, and each morning Jon Snow rose before the sun had fully cleared the walls, and there in the gray light he took up a practice blade and worked through the forms that had been beaten into him at Castle Black, the slow, patient motions that were as much a part of him as breathing. It did not take long for word to spread that the northern stranger meant to test himself against the prince, and men gathered along the edges of the yard to watch, Riverlanders and Targaryen men-at-arms alike, their breath steaming in the cold as they leaned upon spears and murmured wagers to one another. Daemon Targaryen was a warrior born, a man who had made his name with sword and axe long before he had ever ridden a dragon into battle, and when he took the yard against Jon, there was a hunger in him that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the pure joy of the contest. He was older and cannier, and he had fought in more battles than Jon had lived years, and yet he found in the young man an opponent who did not tire and did not falter and did not flinch when the blows came hard and fast. Jon fought the way the North had taught him, without flourish or vanity, giving ground when he must, and taking it back when he could. And there were moments in those long, cold mornings when the older prince found himself pressed harder than he had been in years, and he laughed aloud with the sheer surprise of it. When at last they broke apart, sweat cooling upon their brows despite the chill, Daemon looked upon the bastard of the North with a grin that made him seem, for an instant, a much younger man. It was in the hours after the sparring, when the two of them sat with cups of watered wine in the lee of the broken tower, that Daemon began to speak of the things that lay heavy upon him. He spoke of the Greens with a contempt so cold it seemed to lower the very air between them, calling them usurpers and oath-breakers, who had stolen a crown that was never theirs to take. And yet beneath the anger, Jon heard something rawer, something that Daemon guarded more closely than any secret. He spoke of the sons and grandsons who had fallen in this war, of the young dragonriders lost to fire and treachery, of a family bleeding itself white for the sake of a chair. And when he named the dead, his voice grew quiet in a way that no bluster could disguise. Jon, who knew the shape of grief and the way it hollowed a man out from within, said little, but he listened, and in his silence there was a kind of understanding that no words could have offered, and Daemon seemed to know it, for he did not press for comfort he would not have accepted. Yet Jon was not blind to the other man that lived within the prince, and he saw that man plainly on the fourth day, when a company of scouts brought in a knot of captured green sympathizers, minor lordlings and their sworn men, who had opened their gates to the enemy and now knelt in the mud of the yard with their hands bound behind them. Daemon looked upon them with eyes gone flat and pitiless, and he gave the order for their execution as calmly as another man might order his horse saddled, and something in Jon rose up against it before he had fully weighed the wisdom of speaking. He said, quietly but without a tremor, that these men had yielded, that they had thrown down their arms and asked for mercy, and that to kill men who had surrendered was a thing that stained the killer more deeply than the slain. The yard went still, and Daemon turned upon him with a face like a drawn blade, and for a long moment the two men stood locked in a silence that had grown suddenly dangerous. The prince told him coldly that mercy in war was a luxury paid for in the blood of loyal men, that traitors left living became traitors returned, and that the North might have the leisure for such fine scruples, but the Seven Kingdoms did not. Jon did not yield the point, and he did not raise his voice, and he said only that a man was defined by the oaths he kept and the mercies he granted, and that a war fought without honor was a war already lost whatever the outcome upon the field. It was not agreement that passed between them then, for Daemon did not spare the condemned men, and Jon did not pretend to accept what he could not. And yet in the aftermath, the prince looked upon the young Northman differently, weighing him anew as a creature of some rigid and inconvenient code that would not bend even to the man who might have destroyed him for it. Perhaps it was that very stubbornness that decided him, for that evening Daemon summoned Jon and told him bluntly that he meant to keep him close, and that he was giving over to his command a company of Riverlander foot who needed a steady hand more than they needed a high-born name. He said that the retaking of Tumbleton would be a war of dragons and of desperate men, and that it would test whether northern honor could survive such a crucible, or would burn away like everything else the fire touched. And Jon, meeting the older man's violet gaze without flinching, answered that he supposed they would both find out together. The ravens went out from the encampment before the morning fog had lifted from the river, dark shapes rising against a pale and colorless sky, each of them carrying beneath its wing a scrap of paper sealed with the mark of the prince who commanded them. Riders followed in their wake upon the muddy roads, men who knew the twisting paths of the Trident and the loyalties of the halls that sat beside its waters, and they carried summons phrased not as requests, but as reminders of oaths already sworn and debts long owed to the Black Queen and her cause. Daemon dispatched them with the patience of a man who had gathered armies before and knew the slow arithmetic by which they were assembled, and he watched them go with the quiet certainty of one who understood that the war he intended could not be fought by dragons alone, however terrible the dragons might be. Jon accompanied him to the war council that gathered in the days that followed, held within a great pavilion of dark cloth where the river lords came dripping from the rain to argue among themselves with the bitterness of men who had bled too long and trusted too little. They quarreled first over precedence, over which house should hold the honor of the van and which the shame of the baggage train, and they quarreled next over supply, over grain and forage and the emptied storehouses of a region that had been trampled by armies from both sides until the fields lay barren and the small folk had fled or starved. Above all, they quarreled over fear, though none of them would name it so, over the dragon seeds and their beasts that had turned traitor at Tumbleton and burned the town they had come to defend. For these lords had learned that dragons could not be counted upon to keep faith with the men who fed them. Into that clamor Jon spoke only rarely, and when he spoke plainly, of things the veteran commanders had forgotten to consider in their pride. He asked how many days of provisions the host could carry, and how many the land might yield if they marched in season, and he suggested that the columns move by separate roads and converge only near the enemy, so that no single stretch of ravaged countryside need feed the whole of them at once. He spoke of the order of the march as a matter not of honor but of survival, of placing the seasoned men where the danger lay, and the green levies where they might learn before they were tested. And though the lords bristled at hearing such counsel from a stranger, with a northern name they knew, most of them, that the words were sound. It was the kind of knowledge that came only from having gone hungry in the field, from having watched men die not of swords but of cold and want, and the older captains recognized it as their own, though they resented its source, and a grudging respect began to settle over the pavilion like the settling of dust. It was Jon, too, who first named aloud the thing that Daemon had begun to suspect but had not yet dared to hope for. He proposed that scouts be sent toward Tumbleton, not merely to count the enemy's numbers, but to measure the enemy's heart, to learn whether the host that held the burned town still stood as one, or whether it had begun to come apart from within. He reasoned that men who had watched two dragonriders turn upon their allies would not easily trust the beasts that remained, and that an army built upon treachery would breed further treachery as surely as rot spread through a stored apple, and that somewhere within that camp, the fear and the resentment were already doing the work that no sword could do. Daemon listened to this with a slow, spreading pleasure that transformed his hard face, for the young man had reached by instinct the very conclusion the prince had reached by long and cunning calculation, and he clapped his hand upon Jon's shoulder and declared that the reconnaissance would be ordered at once, and in that decision the shape of the whole campaign began quietly to form. In the quieter hours, when the lords had gone and the lamps burned low, Daemon would sometimes keep Jon behind and ask him of the north, of the great cold lands beyond the neck where the Targaryens had never truly ruled and the dragons had never truly flown. He asked of the mountains and the endless forests and the folk who dwelt among them, and Jon answered him honestly but sparingly, speaking of the wall that stood at the edge of the world and of the men who guarded it, of duty measured not in gold or glory, but in the simple keeping of a watch that never ended. He spoke of oaths taken in the cold before a heart tree, of brotherhood forged among men who had nothing else, and he spoke of these things in a guarded way that told Daemon there was a wound beneath them, a story the Northmen would not tell, a grief or a shame, or perhaps only a loneliness too deep for words. Daemon did not press him, for he was a man who had kept his own secrets across a long and violent life, and knew the value of a silence honored, and instead, he let the bond between them grow in the spaces where questions went unasked. There was in it something that Jon had known before, in the rough tutelage of the men who had shaped him at the edge of the world, a hard affection that expected much and forgave little, and he found himself trusting the old prince more than he had meant to. And then, after many nights of waiting, the first of the scouts returned from the direction of Tumbleton, mud-spattered and breathless, bearing word that the prince had waited for and Jon had foreseen. The scout came into the light of the low fire with his cloak still dripping from a river crossing, and he knelt before Daemon in the manner of a man who had ridden hard through terrain that did not forgive haste. What he carried in his mouth was worth every mile of it, for the tidings from Tumbleton were not of a host preparing to march, but of a host coming apart at its seams. Hugh Hammer, the bastard blacksmith's son, who had ridden the great dragon Vermithor to victory upon the fields before the town, had taken it into his head that the crown might fit his own low brow as well as any king's, and he had spoken of it aloud, where too many ears could hear. A prophecy had followed him, or he had followed a prophecy. The scout could not say which came first, that a hammer would smite the dragons, and a king rise from among the common folk, and Hugh had swelled with the belief that he was that hammer and that king both. Daemon listened without moving, the firelight catching in the deep lines of his face, and Jon watched the old prince's stillness with the quiet attention of a man who had learned to read danger in what did not stir. The army that had ground Tumbleton beneath its heel was no longer one army at all, the scout went on, but 4 armies wearing the same colors and hating one another beneath them. There were men still loyal to the dead Lord Ormond Hightower, who had burned upon the field, and whose memory bound the Western Knights to a cause and a discipline that no longer had a living voice to command it. There were those who followed Prince Daeron, the boy called Daring, who had come to the war a gallant youth and found himself surrounded by monsters he could not master. And there were the 2 dragon seeds, Hugh Hammer with his hammer dreams, and Ulf the White with his wine and his ambitions, each gathering to himself the sellswords and the desperate and the greedy, each looking sidewise at the other, so that the whole vast encampment had become a thing of suspicion and knives held ready in the dark. "They will do half our work for us," Daemon said at last, and there was in his voice a low satisfaction that Jon had not heard before, the pleasure of a hunter who sees the herd turn upon itself. A host divided against its own is not a host, it is a mob waiting for a reason to bleed. He rose and crossed to the map spread upon the trestle, the parchment weighted at its corners with stones, and he traced with one scarred finger the roads that ran toward the town and the ground where an attack might fall. Jon came to stand beside him, and for a while neither spoke, both of them reading the same lines and the same distances, each turning over in his mind the shape of the thing to come. It was upon the 2nd day after this that the men brought in a captured messenger, a green rider who had strayed too far from his fellows and been taken alive in a stand of alders by the river. He was young and frightened, and he told them, when it became clear that his life hung upon his tongue, that there were plots already growing within Tumbleton, like mushrooms in a cellar. Loyalist lords, men who had marched under the Hightower banner and could not stomach a hammersmith calling himself king, were whispering among themselves of a second uprising, a turning that would cast down Hugh and Ulf both and restore the war to those born to fight it. They called it among themselves a second quickening, though the meaning of the words was murky even to the boy who spoke them, and they waited only for a moment and a spark. Jon felt the shape of the opportunity before he could put words to it, and when he did speak, his voice was low and certain in the manner of a man who has seen how battles are truly won. "Then we must not come as a storm from without alone," he said, "but as the answer to a fire already lit within. If these loyalist lords mean to rise against the seeds, let them rise upon the same day we fall upon the walls, so that the enemy faces the sword before them and the knife behind at once. A dragon may burn a field, my prince, but a field does not open its own gates. Men open gates. Give the men within a reason to open them for us, and Tumbleton falls without the cost that dragons pay." Daemon studied him a long moment, and something in the old prince's eyes softened toward agreement, even as his pride reached for the answer he preferred. "You reason well, Northman, and I will send word to these plotters as you counsel, and time are coming to their courage." He turned then toward the tent's opening, where beyond the canvas, the great dark shape of Caraxes shifted against the stars. The bloodworm coiled and waiting, and his voice took on the old fervor. "But do not mistake where the weight of this battle lies. Caraxes will be the thing that decides it. When I take the sky above that town, no host of men divided or whole will stand against the fire." Jon did not flinch from the warning he knew he must give. "There are dragons in Tumbleton still, my prince, Vermithor and Silverwing, and the Tessarion of the boy. If you trust too far in Caraxes alone, and they come up to meet you in the air, then the whole of our fortune rides upon a single throw of the dice, and dragons do not always come down where their riders wish." The words landed, and Daemon said nothing, but Jon saw the seed of caution take root behind the old man's eyes, and he knew it would matter more than either of them yet understood. The march from Harrenhal unfolded across days of gray autumn light, the loyalist host winding south through the riverlands, like some vast, slow river of steel and horseflesh. And each night, when the columns halted and the fires were lit against the deepening cold, Jon Snow did not rest as other men rested. He gathered his company of Riverlanders in whatever cleared ground the camp afforded. Farmers who had fled burning fields and broken men who had lost everything to the war. Boys who had never held a spear, and graybeards who remembered only the plow. And he drilled them until their arms ached and their breath came ragged in the dark. He taught them the shield wall as he had learned it beyond the wall, though he spoke nothing of wights or the cold that walks, only of the truth beneath it, that a line of men who trust one another can hold against horrors that would scatter twice their number if each man stood alone. He walked among them as they trained, correcting a grip here, straightening a shoulder there, and he did not shout as the high-born knights shouted at their levies. He spoke low, and he called them by their names when he could, and when a boy dropped his shield in exhaustion, Jon knelt beside him rather than standing over him, and lifted the wood back into the trembling hands with a word that no other man could hear. There is a thing that passes between men who have been asked to die together and have chosen to trust the choosing, and it passed now from Jon to these forgotten wretches of the Riverlands, until they no longer saw a bastard of the North set over them by a foreign prince, but a captain who would not spend their lives cheaply, and their devotion to him hardened as swiftly and as surely as steel quenched in cold water. On the last night, when the scouts had ridden back with word that Tumbleton lay but a day's march ahead, Daemon Targaryen came to Jon's fire unannounced, carrying a skin of arbor gold and 2 battered cups, and he settled himself upon a stump across the flames, as though he were no prince at all but only an old soldier seeking company against the dark. They drank in silence for a time, watching the embers, and then Daemon began to speak, and there was in his voice a softness Jon had never heard from him, a weariness that the firelight seemed to draw up out of the deep places of the man. He spoke of Rhaenyra, his wife and his queen, whom he had loved since she was a girl and he a man grown, and of the fierce and complicated tenderness between them, and of how he feared what the war was making of her, the suspicion and the grief hollowing out the woman he had known. He spoke of Viserys, his brother the king, dead now these long months, and there was true mourning in it, a grief for the boy Viserys had been before crowns and councils came between them, And Jon understood that beneath all the prince's fire and pride, there lived a man who had watched his family devour itself piece by piece and could not stop the devouring. "We are dragons," Daemon said, staring into the flames, "and dragons cannot help but burn what is nearest to them. I have wondered, Northman, whether the whole of my house is not simply a long, slow burning, and every one of us only fuel for it." Jon listened, and when at last he spoke, it was gently, for he knew something of families torn against themselves, of the loneliness of a name that is both shield and wound. "A man can carry his grief onto a battlefield," he said, "and let it sharpen him, or he can let it become the thing that swings the blade in his stead. I have seen good men die because their hearts wanted vengeance more than their heads wanted victory. Tomorrow you will look down upon the men who betrayed your queen, and there will be a voice in you that says to answer their treachery with fire alone, all at once, without patience. I ask only that you do not listen to it." Daemon was quiet a long while, turning the cup in his weathered hands, and then he told Jon what he meant to do. He would fly Caraxes into the very heart of Tumbleton, down among the roofs and the narrow streets where the dragon seeds and their turned dragons roosted, and he would slay the traitors himself, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer and all their kind, and let them learn what it meant to raise a dragon against the blood of old Valyria. Jon felt a cold dread settle in his chest at the recklessness of it, for he saw at once how a rider alone, amid 3 hostile dragons, might be swarmed and pulled from the sky, and he leaned forward across the fire and spoke with all the urgency he possessed. "Then let it be joined to the ground assault," he pressed. "Wait for my column to strike the walls, so their dragon riders are divided in their attention, so the town is in chaos, and their eyes are pulled downward when you come from above. Do not go in first and alone. Promise me that much." Daemon looked at him across the flames of that last cold camp, and something flickered in the old man's eyes, half amusement and half a thing that might have been affection, and he raised his cup in a slow salute. "You worry like a maester, Northman," he said, "but very well. I will wait for your walls, or I will try to." And Jon marked the words and the lightness in them, and knew that the promise had been given only half in earnest, and the knowing sat in him like a stone as the fire burned down toward its ashes, and the dark host slept its last sleep before the killing. Dawn came gray and slow over the fields south of Tumbleton, the light seeping through a low mist that clung to the grass and softened the edges of the world. And in that pale hour Jon Snow rose from his cold bed of earth and gathered his men about him, without trumpets or shouting, for he had learned long ago that the finest edge was the one that fell before its coming was ever heard. The company he led was not large, a few hundred spears and shields drawn from the loyalist host, men who had fought under his eye for weeks now, and who had come to trust the quiet certainty of him, and they formed their line in the mist with a discipline that the greens across the way had long since drunk away. For the enemy host beyond those crooked outer defenses was no army at all, not truly, but a swollen mass of men grown fat on plunder and idle on victory, their captains quarreling over spoils, their watches half kept, their courage soured into arrogance in the long weeks since the town had fallen to them. Jon had seen it in his dreams and in his waking study both, the great fracture running through the green host like a crack through river ice, and now he meant to drive a wedge into that crack and split it wide. When his men came out of the mist against the earthworks and the hastily heaped barricades, they came as a single wall of overlapping shields, moving as one body, their spears leveled in a bristling hedge, and the drunken sentries who scrambled up too late to meet them died in ones and twos without ever forming a line of their own. There was no glory in it, only the grim mechanical work of soldiers who knew their craft against men who had forgotten theirs. And the shield wall pressed forward through the outer ditches and over the broken palisades, and behind it, the cries of the town began to rise as the loyalist lords hidden within Tumbleton threw off their false allegiance and turned upon the plunderers in the streets. The rebellion within the walls erupted just as he had foreseen it. Doors flung open and hidden blades drawn, men who had bent the knee under duress now rising with hatred long banked in their breasts. And for a span of moments, it seemed the whole thing might unfold exactly as reason had promised, that the town might be taken in a morning by discipline and treachery working hand in hand. But reason had never held dominion over this war, and Jon knew it even as his boots slipped in the mud of the outer ditch. For above them all, beyond the mist, a sound was gathering that no shield wall could answer. Caraxes rose. The bloodworm climbed screaming into the pale sky, his long, lean body coiling against the gray, and upon his back the old prince sat, as though he had never in his life known any other seat, and the sight of him lifting into the dawn sent a shudder through both armies that had nothing to do with the cold. He had not waited for the walls, or he had waited only as long as his restless heart could bear. And now the promise given half in earnest across the dying fire was spent, and Jon felt the stone in his belly turn to ice. For Caraxes did not rise alone into an empty sky. From within the town and from the fields beyond came the answering roars of the Dragonseed's mounts, and Jon lifted his eyes and saw them come. The great bronze fury of Vermithor, climbing on wings that blotted the light, and pale Silverwing wheeling beside him, and others rising into the murk, drawn now to the greens by the treachery of their riders, and the sky above Tumbleton filled with dragons as the earth had never deserved to witness. Then the fire came, and the world ended, and began again in the same terrible breath. Dragon flame washed down across the fields in sheets of gold and green and black, and it did not know friend from foe, did not spare the loyalist who had risen in the streets, nor the plunderer who fled before him, for fire has no allegiance and asks no name before it burns. Jon watched a whole company of men not 50 paces from his own dissolve into a single writhing torch, their screams swallowed by the roaring above, and the heat of it struck his face like an open forge, though he stood well clear. And in that moment, every plan and every discipline meant nothing at all against the indifferent hunger of the beasts overhead. But Jon had walked these fields in his dreams, and he had marked the old stone quarry that lay hard against the western edge of the town, a great pit hewn from the earth in years long past, its walls of sheer gray rock rising higher than a mounted man, and he had marked it in his scouting of the ground days before, reasoning that if the sky filled with fire, his men would need stone above their heads and not open field. "To the quarry," he roared, and his voice cut through the chaos with the weight of a man who has never once been wrong before his own soldiers. "Shields up, and follow me. Leave the dead into the pit." And they came, stumbling and choking, and he herded them down into that stone hollow as the fire swept the open ground above, and the exposed formations that had no such shelter were rendered to ash and bone, while his men crouched living beneath the overhang of the rock. From that refuge, Jon looked out through a gap in the stone and saw Hugh Hammer's personal guard forming below the eastern wall, and he saw, too, the first of the traitor's own men turning their blades inward upon their master, and he gathered his spears about him in the shadow of the quarry and made ready to strike into that confusion while the sky above them burned. The turning of the greens upon their own had begun far from Jon's sight. in the narrow streets nearest the river where Ulf the White had taken up his residence in a merchant's stolen manse. Ulf had passed the whole of the assault in a wine-dark stupor, sprawled across a bed of plundered silks with a flagon still cradled against his chest. And when the loyalist lords who had marched under his banner heard the horns of Daemon's host and saw the sky split open with dragon fire, they understood in a single cold moment where their fortunes truly lay. They came for him not as soldiers but as men who had swallowed too much shame and could swallow no more, dragging him from his bed by the ankles while he cursed and wept and promised them lands he did not own. And they hauled him down the stairs and out into the smoke-choked lane, and there in the mud they cut him down without ceremony, the dragon seed who had betrayed the queen and then betrayed her betrayers, dying at last with wine still wet upon his lips and no dragon near to save him. Jon knew none of this as he burst from the quarry, but he felt the shape of it in the way the enemy ranks buckled inward rather than outward, in the way whole companies had ceased to face him and turned instead upon one another. He led his spearmen up out of the stone hollow at a hard run, shields locked and heads low, and the fire that had scoured the open ground above had passed on toward the eastern quarter, leaving behind a landscape of blackened timber and glowing embers through which his men picked their way with grim purpose. The collapsing Green Command lay ahead of them, and Jon meant to reach it before the enemy could remember that they still outnumbered the Loyalists many times over, before some cooler head among them could stitch the panic back into order and turn the tide once more. Hugh Hammer's guard had drawn together near the eastern wall, a knot of men in mismatched mail who had thrown in their lot with the blacksmith's bastard when he crowned himself in the ruins and named himself a king. They were desperate men, and desperate men fight hardest when they sense that the cause they chose has curdled beneath them. And they closed ranks around whatever remained of Hugh's authority, with the tight, frightened discipline of soldiers who have nowhere left to run. Jon came upon them through the smoke, and he did not slow, and he did not call for parley, for there was no parley to be had with men who had burned a town and murdered their own liege. He struck into their flank with his spearmen behind him, and the melee that followed was a thing of pure ferocity, blade meeting blade in the narrow choke of the lane, the ground slick with blood and ash beneath their boots. He fought the way he had learned to fight in the frozen north, and had never quite unlearned, without flourish and without waste. Each cut delivered where it would end a man and no more. A guardsman lunged at him with a spear, and Jon turned it aside and opened the man's throat before the thrust had spent itself. Another swung an axe that would have cloven his skull, and he stepped inside the arc of it and drove his blade up beneath the arm, and the axe fell useless from a dying hand. His men saw him fight, and something in the sight of it steadied them, for he did not flinch, and he did not falter, and he did not once look back to see whether they still followed. He became to them a kind of standard in the smoke, a dark figure who would not yield, and they rallied to him as though he were a banner planted in the mud, closing the gaps in their line and pressing forward with a courage they had not known they still possessed. The end came for Hugh Hammer sooner than it might have, for it was Jon's spearmen breaking his guard that gave the wronged lords their opening, and they fell upon him amid the ruin of his ambition. The very lords who had knelt to him in the ruins, who had watched him seize a crown he had no right to wear, fell upon him in the collapse of the fighting, and they struck him down amid the ruin of his ambition, the blacksmith's son, who had reached for a kingdom and grasped only fire. Jon saw the moment of it through a break in the press, saw the great brute stagger and fall beneath a dozen blades, and he felt no triumph in it, only a cold and creeping dread, because he understood before any of the cheering men around him what the death of that man truly meant. For high above them, wheeling against a sky choked with black smoke and lit from beneath by the burning town, the great bronze dragon Vermithor had felt its rider die. Jon saw the beast wheel and shudder in its flight, saw it turn in a wide and aimless arc with no hand upon the reins to guide it, and no voice it would answer, and he watched the vast wings hammer the smoke into churning eddies as the maddened creature loosed a torrent of flame upon friend and foe alike, upon the men who had killed its master and the men who had never known him. The dragon was riderless now, and a riderless dragon in its grief and fury was a thing no army could stand against, a peril greater than any spear or sword or crowned pretender in all the field below. Jon turned toward the place where Caraxes had last descended, cupping his hands about his mouth, and he shouted Daemon's name into the roar of the flames, and the roar swallowed it whole. Caraxes had come to rest upon a low rise at the eastern edge of the field, where the mangled remnants of the green vanguard lay scattered like broken toys among the smoking ruins of their own encampment, and upon the dragon's back Daemon Targaryen sat wreathed in triumph, his crimson blade catching the fire glow so that it seemed a shard of the sunset itself. The traitor dragonseeds were dead. Hugh Hammer had fallen with a spear through his throat, and Ulf the White had been cut down in his cups before he could ever mount his beast, and the plot that had turned two dragons against their proper cause lay unraveled in the mud. The green host was breaking apart, streaming southward in a ragged tide of men who threw down their shields and ran, and any commander of prudence would have looked upon that scene and known that the day was already won, that all that remained was to gather what could be gathered and quit the field before the maddened dragons overhead made carrion of victor and vanquished alike. But Daemon was not a man of prudence, and he had never been, not in all his long and glittering years, and Jon Snow understood this with a sinking certainty as he watched the great crimson dragon lift its narrow head and turn its gaze upon a single rider fleeing amid the wreck of the green lines. For there, mounted upon a courser lathered white with terror, rode a slender figure in armor chased with gold, a boy scarcely grown into his manhood, and Jon knew him even at that distance for what he was. Prince Daemon Targaryen, called the Daring, the youngest son of Queen, and one of the last significant green princes still fighting, was fleeing across the shattered field with Tessarion somewhere behind him when Daemon caught sight of him. Daemon had survived where many of his kin had not, but the war was closing around him now, and Daemon knew that if he allowed the boy to escape, the dance would claim him sooner or later. Jon shouted again, though he knew the futility of it, though the roar of flame and the shrieking of dying men swallowed every word he could raise. He waved his arms in wide and desperate arcs, signaling with everything his body could offer that Daemon must climb, must withdraw, must put distance between Caraxes and the two riderless beasts that thrashed and wheeled above the smoke like grieving titans. But the prince upon the dragon paid him no heed, if indeed he saw him at all. Caraxes gathered his haunches and sprang skyward, wings cracking like the sails of some vast ship taking the wind, and the dragon rose in pursuit of the fleeing boy with a hunger that no counsel of men could temper. For a moment, Jon stood frozen, watching the crimson shape ascend into the churning dark, and the cold that had settled in his chest hardened into something close to despair. He had warned of this. In the quiet hours before the battle, in the guttering light of the war tent, he had spoken plainly of the danger of pursuit, of the fatal temptation to chase a broken enemy into ground where a man might himself be broken, and Daemon had smiled at him with that easy contempt the old wear for the young, and had said that a Targaryen upon a dragon needed no lessons in war from a boy of the north. Now the words returned to Jon with the bitter taste of prophecy, and he knew that watching would avail him nothing. He turned from the rise and plunged down into the burning streets of Tumbleton, where the world had become a labyrinth of fire and smoke and shrieking confusion. A horse stood riderless near a collapsed stable, its eyes rolling white with terror, its flanks trembling, and Jon seized its reins and swung himself into the saddle with a soldier's swiftness, gentling the beast with a low murmur even as he wheeled it toward the eastern gate. He rode through streets that had become rivers of flame, past bodies that no longer stirred, and men who screamed and clawed at burning garments. And he cut through the routing greens who stumbled into his path, with the flat of his blade where he could, and the edge where he could not. For they were beyond reason now, beyond banner or cause, animals in the grip of a fear that had unmade them utterly. Timber crashed behind him as a burning house folded in upon itself, and sparks rained down like a storm of dying stars. And still Jon drove the frightened horse onward, seeking any vantage of high ground from which he might see the sky and read the ruin unfolding within it. He came at last to a broken length of the town wall, where the stone had crumbled into a rubble slope, and there he reined the beast to a halt and looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. High above the burning town, Caraxes had run down his prey. Jon saw the crimson dragon close upon the fleeing boy, saw the vast wings fold and the long neck strike downward, and for one terrible and glorious instant, it seemed that Daemon Targaryen had earned the total victory his recklessness had reached for, that the last of the queen's enemies would fall, and the field would be his beyond all dispute. The greens were broken utterly now, the pretender's cause scattered to the wind, and Daemon rode the sky like a god come down to reap. But the sky was no longer a place for gods. It was a death trap of maddened beasts, a Vermithor wheeling in its grief, and Silverwing thrashing in blind and masterless fury, and both of them turning now, drawn by the sound and the motion and the scent of another of their kind, toward the crimson dragon that had strayed too far and stayed too long. Jon's heart sank into a cold and airless place, for he saw what Daemon in his triumph could not, and he understood that the very recklessness he had warned against was about to demand its price, and that the price would be paid in full. Vermithor came out of the smoke like a slide of dark bronze off a mountainside, riderless and ruined by grief, its great scarred head lowered, and its wings hammering the ash-thick air into a storm that flattened banners and threw men from their feet along the low ground where the fighting had been thickest. The old dragon had lost the man who woke it from a century of sleep, and something in that loss had unhinged whatever patience the beast had ever possessed, so that it charged now not toward any enemy it could reason out, but toward the nearest living dragon shape in the sky, and that shape was Caraxes, wings still spread above the fleeing boy, neck still bent to the killing stroke, wholly and perfectly blind to the doom rushing up beneath its unguarded flank. Jon had reached the archer's rampart by then, a hasty thing of piled stone and shattered wagon timber that some sergeant of the Queen's Foot had thrown together at the field's edge, and from that small height he could see the whole shape of the ruin as it gathered, the angle of Vermithor's charge, and the softness of Daemon's exposed side, and the handful of heartbeats that remained before the one closed upon the other. He might have done nothing. There would have been a grim justice in doing nothing, in letting the prince's own arrogance answer for itself the way it had answered for so many others, and Jon felt the temptation of that stillness pass through him like a cold current, the whisper that told him the field would be cleaner without a man who spent lives the way lesser men spent copper. But it passed, as such whispers always passed in him, and what remained was the plain and stubborn thing he had carried out of the north, the thing that could not stand idle while a death it might prevent came howling down. He turned to the scorpion crews, who crouched behind their great bolt throwers, half of them frozen with terror at the beasts that filled the sky. And he did not shout at them the way another captain might have shouted, for he had learned long ago that terrified men do not hear rage. He spoke instead in a voice pitched low and hard and certain, telling them where to aim and when to loose, and he swept his arm toward the archers beside them and gathered their frightened eyes to the point of his gauntlet, to the great bronze flank that swelled ever larger in their vision, and he held them all in the discipline of his own calm, until the moment stretched taut as a drawn string. Not at the prince, he told them, and not at the crimson one, but at the bronze death behind him, at the wing, and the wounded eye, and the soft place beneath the jaw, and hold, and hold, and now. The volley left the rampart as a single thing, a converging sleet of iron bolts and gray-feathered shafts that struck Vermithor across the neck and the near wing and the ridge above its ruined eye. And though not one of those missiles could have killed so vast a creature, together they did what Jon had prayed they might, for they hurt it and confused it and turned its grief into fresh and blinding pain. The old dragon screamed and flinched sidewise, its charge breaking as a wave breaks upon a stone, and instead of driving home into Caraxes' flank, it veered and crashed downward through its own momentum, plowing a long black furrow across the smoking earth, well clear of the prince, thrashing and bellowing in a fury that now had nowhere to spend itself. Daemon felt the wind of that passage, even as it missed him, and whatever thoughts had ridden with him toward the fleeing boy were scattered in an instant, for even so reckless a man could not mistake how near his death had come. He wrenched Caraxes up and away, abandoning the pursuit of Daeron in the very moment of its completion, and the boy on his stumbling brown mount lived because a dragon had come to kill a Targaryen and been driven off by a bastard's cold and careful mind. Somewhere beneath the noise and the terror, Daemon remembered a conversation upon a windswept wall, a promise given half in earnest to a northern captain who had spoken of caution beside a dying fire, and though he could not have said why he honored it then, in that crucial and narrow instant he broke off and disengaged and did not fling himself again into the killing sky. Caraxes descended in a great spiral of trembling wings and settled at last amid Jon's rallying company, the crimson body steaming, one wing scorched black along its trailing edge where some green dragon's fire had caught it in the chaos of the day, and Daemon Targaryen slid from the saddle to stand swaying upon the ash-strewn ground. Half his face was blistered, and his silver hair hung lank with sweat and soot, and his breath came in the ragged heaves of a man who has run to the edge of the world and looked over it. And for a long moment he said nothing at all. He only looked at Jon across the ruined field, across the smoking rampart and the frightened archers, and the vast bronze shape that still thrashed its rage into the distant earth. And in that look was something the proud prince had shown to no man in all his long and bloody years. It was not gratitude, for gratitude was a thing Daemon had never learned to wear, and it was not quite respect, though respect was folded somewhere within it. It was the naked acknowledgement of a debt, the recognition burning in his violet eyes that his life had been in this man's keeping, and that this man had chosen to keep it. And Daemon Targaryen, who had never in his life owed his breath to another, stood breathing hard in the wreckage, and knew, without a word, that now he did. The dawn that followed came gray and slow, a pale light seeping over the ruin of Tumbleton, as though the sky itself were reluctant to look upon what the night had wrought. Where there had once been a town of orchards and low stone houses, there was now a wilderness of char and cinder, timbers still glowing sullen orange in the ashen dark, and thin ribbons of smoke rising from 100 smoldering ruins to lace the morning air with the smell of burned wood and burned flesh that would linger in the memory of every man who lived to leave that place. The Loyalists held it. That much was certain when the light came, for the black banners still stood upon the broken rampart, and the green host had scattered into the countryside. But it was a holding purchased at so terrible a price that the men who wandered the streets in the first hours of morning did so like sleepwalkers, moving through the wreckage with the stunned and hollow slowness of those who cannot yet reckon what they have survived. It was Jon who gave the day its shape. He did not wait for command nor counsel, but moved among the living with a quiet authority that no title had granted him, and men followed his voice because it was steady when every other thing had broken. He set the strongest of the surviving men to the work of clearing the wounded from the field, and he made no distinction between the black and the green in the doing of it. For a man crying out with his belly opened cried the same in either cause, and Jon had seen too much of death in the far cold north to believe that the dying owed anything to the banners under which they fell. Braziers were kindled for the maesters, and clean water was carried up from the river, and the wounded were laid in rows within the shell of a great hall whose roof the flames had eaten, so that they lay beneath the open sky with the smoke drifting above them like a shroud not yet lowered. The dead were another matter, and a harder one. There were so many of them, blackened and broken and beyond all knowing, that the burying of them would be the labor of days. Yet Jon insisted upon it all the same, insisted that pits be dug, and that the fallen of both hosts be laid within them, with such rites as could be managed. For he would not leave men to rot in the streets like the leavings of some great and careless feast. And when the green survivors came stumbling out of cellars and ditches with their hands raised and their eyes wide with the certainty of slaughter, it was Jon who commanded that they be spared, that any man who yielded be given his life. And this time, standing in the ruin with the ash gray upon his blistered face, Daemon did not overrule him. The prince who had let the sack run unchecked, who had watched Tumbleton burn and thought it justice, said only that the command should stand, and men who had braced themselves to die found themselves given bread instead, and did not understand it, and wept. Later, when the worst of the ordering was done, the two of them walked the ruined streets together, and there was no one near enough to overhear what passed between them. The prince moved stiffly, favoring the side the dragonfire had scorched, and for a long while he said nothing, only looked at the devastation he had helped to make with an expression Jon had not seen upon him before. When at last he spoke, his voice was low and rough with smoke, and with something else beneath it. "You were right," Daemon said, and the words came slowly, as though each were a stone he must lift and set down with care. "About the dragons, about what they are, I thought them the answer to every question, and I was wrong." He stopped beside the blackened doorway of a house that no longer had walls to hold it, and he stared into the gutted dark of it. "Vengeance is a fire that does not know its master. I lit it, and it turned upon me, and had you not been there, it would have eaten me as it ate all the rest." He looked at Jon then, and the pride that had armored him all his life had cracked, and through the crack showed a man weary unto his bones. "I have owed no man my life before. I find I do not know how to carry it." "You carry it forward," Jon said quietly. "You spare the men you might have burned. That is how the debt is paid." Daemon considered this for a long moment, and then he inclined his head, a small motion, but a real one, and something between them settled that would not come undone. It was into this fragile new understanding that the rider came, his horse lathered and stumbling, bearing word that the loyalists had feared to hear. Prince Daemon the Daring, the boy who had ridden Targaryen against them, had not perished in the fire and the rout. He had slipped from the field alive and fled south with what men he could gather, and so long as he lived and his dragon flew, the war was not ended, whatever ruin lay behind them. Yet even as the weight of that news settled upon Daemon's soot-streaked features, the truth of what they had won pressed harder still, for 2 of the traitor dragon seeds lay dead in the ashes of their treachery. Tumbleton was retaken, and the momentum of the whole long bloody dance had swung, in the space of a single burning night, decisively into the hands of the Blacks, and Daemon Targaryen, standing amid the ruin he had wrought and been spared, knew that nothing after this would be as it had been before. The road toward Harrenhal wound through country that had forgotten what peace had felt like, past fields gone to seed, and villages emptied of their people. And along that road, the army moved in the loose, weary column of men who had won something at great cost and did not yet know whether the cost had been worth the winning. Daemon rode at the head of it, and where in the days before he had ridden apart, wrapped in the old bitterness that had made him a legend and a warning in equal measure, now he called Jon forward often to ride at his side, and they spoke as they went of things a prince did not usually share with a man he had known only a season. It began with small matters, the disposition of scouts and the husbanding of provisions, but it deepened as the miles fell away behind them, and Jon came to understand that Daemon had taken him into that narrow inner circle where a man keeps only those he trusts to tell him truths he does not wish to hear. Jon used that trust carefully, the way a man handles a blade he respects. He did not counsel caution as a coward counsels it, for Daemon would have despised that and seen through it in a heartbeat, but rather as a soldier who had learned that the surest way to lose a war was to win a battle too gloriously. When Daemon spoke of pressing south at once to catch Daemon before the boy could regroup, Jon reminded him of the men who could barely stand, of the horses foundering under them, of the way an army stretched thin became an army waiting to be broken. He spoke of discipline as a kind of mercy, of patience as a kind of strength, and slowly, in the manner of a river wearing its stone, he began to turn the prince away from the reckless brilliance that had always been both his glory and the seed of his undoing. It was on a night when they made camp beneath a stand of oaks, the fire burning low and the sentries murmuring at the edge of the light, that Jon at last spoke the thing he had carried alone through all the blood and fire since he had come into that broken age. He had not meant to speak it, or perhaps he had always meant to, and only waited for the moment when it could do no harm and might yet do some good. And the words came out of him quietly, without drama, the confession of a man too tired to guard his secrets any longer. He told Daemon that he did not belong to this time, that he had come from an age so distant it would have seemed a fable, from beyond the far end of the years, and that he knew how this war would go if it were left to run its natural and terrible course. Daemon did not laugh, and he did not reach for his sword, and he did not summon the maester to look into the eyes of a madman. He sat very still, the firelight moving across the hard planes of his face, and for a long while he said nothing at all, and Jon waited in that silence with the particular dread of a man who has staked everything on a single throw. Then the prince spoke, and his voice was low and thoughtful, and he said that he had seen things in his long life that no maester's book could account for, that he had ridden Caraxes over the ruins of old Valyria, and felt the wrongness of that place in his bones, that the weirwoods were said to hold the memory of all that ever was and would be, and that the world was older and stranger, than the men who tried to rule it ever cared to admit. He had watched Jon Snow through fire and hardship and the near approach of death, and he had never once seen the man flinch from what was true. And so, he said, he would sooner believe an honest man's impossible tale than a liar's easy one. There was a weight in the way Daemon looked at him then, a searching quality, and Jon understood that the prince was not merely humoring him, but was turning the knowledge over in that quick and dangerous mind, measuring what it meant. He asked what became of his house, of his blood, of the dragons that were the last wonder of the world, and Jon told him as gently as he could that the fire consumed them all, that brother destroyed brother, and the great beasts dwindled and died in the smoke of their master's pride, and that the dance ended not in triumph for either side, but in a ruin so complete that men counted it the death of an age. Daemon listened to all of it, and something in his eyes changed, hardening not into anger but into resolve, and he said that a man who knew the shape of the fire might yet learn to step out of its path. He swore then, by the old gods and the new and by the fire that was the blood of his house, that he would keep Jon's secret to the grave, and Jon believed him, for whatever else Daemon Targaryen had been in his long turbulent life, he had never been a man who broke a vow given in earnest. And having sworn it, Daemon fell silent again, gazing into the coals as though he could read in them the branching paths of all that might yet come. And when he spoke once more, it was not of vengeance or of glory, but of an ending, of a peace that might be bought before the whole realm burned. And Jon heard in those words the first faint bending of a fate that had seemed carved in stone, and dared, for the first time, to hope. The days that followed carried a strange new quality, as though the war itself had drawn a breath and reconsidered its own violence. Where before the loyalist host had lurched from bloody chance to bloody chance, spending men and dragons as a drunkard spends coin, now there was a deliberateness in its movements that unsettled friend and foe alike. Daemon rode at the head of the columns with a patience no one who had known him in younger years would have believed, and Jon rode a half-length behind, and between them passed a quiet understanding that shaped the whole shape of the campaign. They took the crossings of the riverlands one by one, not in reckless charges, but in careful sequence, cutting the green supply lines, seizing the fords, denying the enemy the ground on which a desperate battle might turn against them. The riverlands in that season lay green and sodden beneath a soft gray sky, the fields heavy with the rot of trampled crops, the roads churned to mud by the passage of armies. It was not a beautiful country in war, but there was a mournful gentleness to it, the willows bending over the swollen streams, the mist rising at dawn from the low ground, and hanging there until the pale sun burned it away. Through this drowned and patient land, the loyalist host moved with a discipline that spread outward from its two commanders, like warmth from a hearth, and the small victories accumulated, each one modest in itself, each one costing little, until together they amounted to something that the maesters who later chronicled the war could scarcely explain. For the true measure of what Daemon and Jon accomplished lay not in what they did, but in what they refused to do. They did not send their dragons hurtling against the enemy's dragons in the great mutual ruin that fate had once decreed, that terrible arithmetic in which each side traded its most precious weapons until both were bankrupt of them and the sky was emptied of wonder. Jon had seen that future written in the coals of memory, and he steered the war away from it as a helmsman steers a ship from rocks he alone can see beneath the surface. And Daemon, trusting him, let himself be steered toward a reckoning that would give the fans of that famous duel something greater than mutual ruin. The dragons of the Black Cause remained whole, their riders alive, their strength conserved rather than squandered, and this hoarding of power, invisible to the enemy, was worth more than a dozen won battles. Yet Jon came to see, in the careful watching that had become his habit, that Daemon carried within him still a private hunger that no discipline of the daylight had wholly quenched. He noticed how the prince's gaze drifted, in unguarded moments, toward the west, toward the vast pale sheet of the god's eye that lay beyond the horizon, and how a particular stillness came over him whenever the name of Aemond, the one-eyed prince who still rode Vhagar abroad in the realm, was spoken in council. He marked the letters that came and went by night, the messages Daemon sent that were not part of any strategy Jon had helped devise, and slowly, piece by piece, he assembled the truth of what the man intended. Daemon was baiting the one-eyed prince, taunting him, offering himself as a challenge that no proud son of the dragon could refuse, drawing Aemon toward a meeting above those wide gray waters where two of the greatest dragons in the world might tear each other from the sky and drown together in the deep. It was the doom that had claimed them both in the world Jon had seen, and knowing it, he went to Daemon on a cold evening when the camp had settled into the low murmur of tired men, and he spoke plainly. He said that a duel above the lake was death, not victory, that whatever satisfaction it might give to spend Aemon's life would be bought with Daemon's own, and that the realm could ill afford to lose the one commander whose name still frightened the enemy in his bones. Daemon heard him out in silence, seated on a camp stool with his hands folded and the firelight moving across the sharp lines of his face, and for a long while he said nothing at all. When at last he spoke, his voice was low and stripped of all its old bravado. He confessed that the hunger for the meeting had been in him since Tumbleton, that it felt like the only clean thing left in a war grown dirty, a matter of blood and honor decided by two men in the open sky, rather than by mud and hunger and the slow grinding of hosts. Yet he confessed also that he was tired of feeding the fire, that Jon's account of the ruin to come had lodged in him like a splinter, and that he had begun to understand, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the grandest death was not the same thing as the wisest one. And so he agreed. It cost him something visible to say it, a pride surrendered that had defined him for 40 years, but he said it plainly and did not take it back, that he would let disciplined war decide the matter, and not a single reckless combat in which the whole cause might sink beneath the lake. He would keep Aemond as a problem to be solved by armies and by the coordinated flight of many dragons, cornering the Green Prince on ground of their own choosing, rather than throwing himself into the jaws of a mutual grave. Aemond remained abroad in the world, and Vhagar with him, ancient and terrible and undefeated, a shadow that darkened every plan they made. But now the Blacks moved to hem that shadow in, their surviving dragons ranging in careful concert, their armies closing like fingers upon the riverlands, and Jon felt the war turning beneath him toward something no chronicle had ever recorded. The ground they chose was a broad and broken valley south of the ruined town, a place where the land itself conspired with their design, for a long ridge rose along its eastern edge crowned with old stone, and a marsh spread across its southern reach where a great weight coming down from the sky would find no easy footing. Jon had walked that valley on foot in the gray hours before dawn, feeling the soft give of the earth beneath his boots, marking where the reeds hid pools deep enough to swallow a man to the waist, and he had understood that Vhagar's very size, the thing that made her terrible, might in the right place be turned against her, for a beast so vast could not maneuver where a smaller dragon might climb and turn and dart away. They set the scorpions upon the ridge with painstaking care, dragging the great bolt throwers up the slope through the night, and cloaking them in cut brush and fallen timber, so that no watcher from above would mark their positions until it was far too late. The crews were the steadiest men Jon could find, Riverlander archers and northern spearmen who had learned in the long weeks of this war to hold their nerve while horror wheeled overhead. And he moved among them speaking quietly, telling each crew which patch of sky was theirs and no other, so that when the moment came, they would loose in overlapping arcs rather than all at once at the same target. He did not want a single killing blow. He wanted a net woven of iron bolts, a cage of the air itself into which the old dragon would be driven and could not easily break free. Daemon flew Caraxes at the head of it, and with him ranged the surviving loyalist dragons in a loose and careful concert, each rider schooled to a task, none of them to close with Vhagar alone. The plan was to bait the Green Prince, to show him a mark he could not resist, and then to fold in from three sides while the scorpions on the ridge stripped the air around him of any path to safety. It was a colder thing than a duel, and Daemon had chafed against its coldness even as he bent himself to it. But he had given his word and he kept it, and when Aemond at last rose from the mists of the morning astride his ancient mount, drawn out by the sight of loyalist banners moving in the valley below, Daemon did not fly to meet him in single glory. He drew back and drew Aemond after him, deeper into the broken ground where the marsh waited. What followed was fierce and costly and swift, a thing of screaming beasts and fire that boiled the standing water into steam, and Vhagar in her fury killed more than one loyalist dragon before the trap fully closed, her jaws vast enough to shear through wing and rider both. But the scorpions spoke from the ridge in their overlapping arcs, bolts long as spears hammering into her flank and wing, and every time Aemon turned to break away, he found the sky filled with iron and with lesser dragons harrying him from angles he could not answer all at once. He was a great warrior, and he fought as one, but he had been drawn onto ground where no single greatness could prevail, and in the end, Caraxes and the last of the loyalist dragons overwhelmed him together, closing upon him from above and from the sides as Vhagar faltered in the churned and steaming marsh, until Vhagar, dragging a dozen bolts and bleeding from a score of wounds, made one last terrible rush that cost the blacks 2 more dragons before Caraxes tore out her throat, and the greatest beast of the age came down at last into the mud and did not rise again. Daemon watched it end without triumph in his face, only a grim and weary knowledge, for he had wanted the killing blow to be his own and had surrendered that wanting for something larger, and the surrender still ached in him even in victory. Word of Aemon's death reached King's Landing before the smoke had cleared, and the Green faction that had held the city collapsed inward upon itself with a speed that spoke of how much had rested upon that single terrible sword and mount. Their dragons were devastated, their armies scattered across the riverlands, and the lords who had bound their fortunes to the boy king found themselves suddenly holding a losing hand at a table where the stakes were their own heads. Panic moved through the Red Keep like a fever, counselors fleeing to their ships, servants abandoning their posts, the great machinery of a usurping court grinding to a halt as its heart failed. It was then that Jon counseled restraint, and it was the hardest counsel he had yet given, for the appetite for vengeance ran deep among the blacks, and the temptation to take the city by fire and by dragon was very great. He spoke to Daemon in a torch-lit tent while the rain drummed on the canvas above them, saying that a city sacked would feed a hatred that outlasted every man now living, that the small folk of King's Landing had not chosen this war and did not deserve to burn for it, and that a throne won atop a mountain of the innocent dead was a throne that would never know a peaceful night. Offer terms, he urged, to the war-weary lords, who wanted only to go home, spare the capital the flames, and the starvation that a crueler path would surely bring, and let Rhaenyra take her seat through strength tempered by mercy rather than through ashes. Daemon listened, his sharp face unreadable in the shifting light, and for a long while he said nothing at all, the rain filling the silence between them. And then, at last, he reached for parchment and quill and began, in his own hand, to write out the terms by which the Greens might yield. The terms Daemon set to parchment that night traveled ahead of the Black Host like a soft rain before a storm, and by the time Rhaenyra came at last to King's Landing, the great gates opened, not to fire, but to the quiet surrender of men who had grown weary of dying. There was no sack. The Red Keep received its queen through halls swept clean of the dead, and though the smell of the war still hung in the streets, the small folk who lined the way watched with cautious eyes rather than the empty stares of the starved. Rhaenyra ascended the black iron steps of her father's throne with Daemon at her shoulder, alive against every expectation, his hand resting lightly upon the pommel of Dark Sister. And when she seated herself upon the barbed and twisted seat, the hall fell into a hush so complete that Jon could hear the wind moving through the high windows above. He stood well back among the assembled lords, and he watched. It was the watching that had always come most easily to him, the habit of a man who had never quite belonged in any room he entered, and from the edges of that great chamber he saw what the newly restored court did not yet wish to see. He saw the way certain lords who had bent the knee to the queen kept their eyes fixed on the men across the hall who had once served the other side, and he saw in those glances the slow, patient accounting of old debts. There was a brother slain at the Gullet, a castle burned in the Riverlands, a daughter taken hostage and returned diminished. These were not wounds that a crown upon a woman's brow could close, and Jon knew from the marrow of his own long memory how such grievances lived on, nursed through winter after winter, until they woke again as war. He said as much to Daemon that evening, in a solar high in the keep where the candles guttered against the draught, and the two of them sat over cups of southern wine that Jon barely touched. He told the prince that a throne restored was not the same as a realm at peace, that the men who had lost fathers and sons would not forget who had taken them, and that mercy offered once at the point of victory meant nothing unless it was made into something lasting. Daemon regarded him across the small table, and there was in the older man's eyes now a quality Jon had not seen in him before, a stillness where once there had been only the restless hunger for the next fight, the next conquest, the next slight to be avenged. The war had changed Daemon as surely as it had changed the boy who followed him, and where once he had been the spark that set kingdoms alight, he had begun, almost against the grain of his own nature, to understand the harder art of keeping them from burning. In the weeks that followed, Jon saw that understanding take shape in ways he had not thought the man capable of. Daemon moved through the court not as a warrior, but as a weaver, and thread by patient thread, he began to knit the torn edges of the realm back together. He counseled Rhaenyra against the executions her hardest advisors demanded, arguing that a dead lord left a bitter heir, but a spared one might be bound by gratitude and obligation. And where justice was necessary, he made certain it fell measured and public, rather than in the shadowed cruelty of the dungeons. He arranged marriages between the houses that had bled one another, so that a daughter of the Blacks might wed a son of the Greens, and their children would carry both loyalties in a single blood. And in this way, he made of the peace a living thing, rather than a signature upon a page. Jon watched grievances that might have festered for generations, bought off with land and honor and the promise of a shared future, and he understood that Daemon was spending the whole of his fearsome reputation not to threaten now, but to reassure, and that this was perhaps the bravest thing the prince had ever done. The queen did not forget the northern stranger who had stood beside her uncle at Tumbleton, and when she summoned Jon before her, she offered him more than he had ever thought to be offered in this borrowed life. There were lands in the Reach, rich and green and untouched by the fighting, and a lordship to go with them, and a place at her council should he wish it, for she named him a hero of the war and said that the realm owed him a debt it could not easily repay. Jon knelt upon the cold stone before the throne, and he thanked her with words carefully chosen, and then, gently, he declined it all, though not before she pressed him once more to lead her armies against the last rebel holdouts in the North's name. He could not have said aloud why the offer felt like a door closing rather than opening, only that titles and holdings in this age of dead dragons and living lords would bind him to a place and a time that was not his own, and he had begun to feel, in the quiet hours, that he was a ghost, wearing the shape of a man, honored for deeds in a story he had wandered into by some path he could not name. It was Daemon alone who understood. Later, when the court had emptied and the two of them walked the battlements beneath a sky heavy with stars, the prince spoke without looking at him, saying that he had seen the way Jon watched the horizon to the north, and that he knew the look of a man wondering whether he could ever go home. And Jon, standing at the edge of that high wall, with the wind cold against his face, found that he did not know how to answer. The days that followed were slow and heavy with the knowledge of endings. Jon rode north from the capital with a small escort granted by the queen, though he had asked for no company and would have preferred to travel the roads alone. And Daemon rode beside him for the first stretch of that journey, the two of them speaking little and needing to speak less. They passed through country still scarred by war, through villages where the smoke of rebuilding rose thin against gray skies, and everywhere the small folk paused in their labor to watch the dark rider and his companion go by, not knowing that one of them had come from a time not yet born, only sensing in some wordless way that these were men who had touched something larger than themselves and carried its weight in the set of their shoulders. The weirwood grove of the Riverlands lay deep within an old wood that no axe had troubled in 100 years, and it was there, in the still green heart of that forest, that Jon meant to test whether the magic that had drawn him back through the centuries might yet carry him home again. He did not know if it would answer. He had spent long nights turning the question over in his mind, remembering the green mist that had risen among the roots on the far side of his own life, remembering the moment the world had tilted and the cold of the wall had given way to the heat of battle at Tumbleton, and he understood that he was staking everything he had left on a hope thin as morning frost. Yet he could not stay. Some part of him had known that from the first, from the moment he had opened his eyes in a strange age and found himself alive when he had every reason to believe he was not. They made their farewell at the edge of the grove, where the trees grew close and the light fell dappled and soft through the canopy. Daemon Targaryen was not a man given to soft words, and Jon had never expected them from him, and so it surprised them both when the prince spoke of what Jon had done, not in the language of battles won, but in the language of something saved that could not be seen or counted. He told Jon that a man might fight 100 fights and change nothing, and that the rarest thing in all the world was a fight that turned the course of things toward mercy rather than ruin, and that this was what Jon had given him, not merely a life pulled back from the edge, but a reason to spend that life on something better than fire and vengeance. He said that he had been a man half in love with his own darkness for the whole of his years, and that Jon had shown him, without ever meaning to, what it looked like to carry a hard duty without letting it hollow you out from the inside. Then Daemon drew from his belt a dagger, its blade dark and rippled with the smoky patterns that only Valyrian steel could hold, its pommel worn smooth by years of a prince's hand, and he pressed it into Jon's palm and closed his fingers over it. He said that it was a poor gift for a man who had asked for nothing, but that steel forged in dragon flame ought to travel with a man of winter, and that wherever Jon was going, whatever cold waited for him there, he wanted a piece of this age to go with him so that he would know it had been real. And Jon, who had spent his whole life feeling himself the least of the men around him, the bastard granted nothing and owed nothing, found his throat tight and his eyes stinging in a way he had not felt since he was a boy. They clasped arms then, the Prince of Dragons and the Bastard of Winterfell, two men of winter separated by centuries and bound by something neither could name, and neither of them spoke, for there was nothing left worth saying that the silence did not say better. Jon walked into the grove alone. The trees closed behind him, and the sounds of the world grew faint and far away, the bird song hushing, the wind stilling among the branches, until the whole wood seemed to be holding its breath. At the center stood a weirwood ancient beyond reckoning, its bark pale as bone, its carved face weeping red sap from eyes that seemed to follow him as he came near. And beneath it, the roots spread wide and knotted across the earth, like the veins of some sleeping giant. He knelt among them upon the cold ground, and he laid his hand flat against the trunk, and he closed his eyes and thought of the wall, of Ghost, of the family that waited for him in an age not yet come, of the vows he had spoken and the duty he had never truly set down. For a long moment nothing happened, and doubt rose in him cold and sharp, the fear that he had crossed too great a distance to be pulled back, that he would kneel here until his knees ached and rise to find himself still trapped in a borrowed life. And then the mist came. It rose from the roots pale and green, and glowing with a light that was not of the sun, curling around his wrists and his throat, and he felt the world begin to tilt beneath him, the way a boat tilts when it slips its mooring and the current takes it. His heart hammered against his ribs. The face in the weirwood seemed to smile, or perhaps he only imagined it, and the green light swelled until it swallowed the whole of the grove and the whole of the age around him, and Jon Snow let go, and fell, and was gone. He woke to cold that he knew, a cold that belonged to him, and to no other place in all the world, the deep and honest cold of the far north pressing against his skin like an old companion. Snow drifted past the narrow window of a chamber he recognized, and somewhere below the beams, a fire crackled low in its hearth, and when he turned his head, he saw the great white shape of Ghost lying beside the bed, one ear lifting at the sound of his stirring. The dire wolf's red eyes found him in the gloom, and there was no surprise in them, only the patient certainty of a creature who had waited and never doubted that his master would return. Jon reached down with a hand that trembled slightly and buried his fingers in the thick fur at Ghost's neck, and he felt the warmth of the living animal, the slow rise and fall of breath, and only then did he truly believe that he had come home. At his hip, resting on the wooden chest beside the bed, lay the Valyrian dagger, its dark ripples catching the firelight the way still water catches moonlight, and he understood that it had come back with him across the vast gulf of years. It was proof of a kind, though proof he could never show, for who among the living would believe that the blade had once been carried into a battle 3 centuries gone, in a war that the histories remembered dimly and that he alone remembered in full. In the days that followed, he found himself drawn to the maester's rooms. At every hour he could steal from his duties, to the shelves of yellowed parchment and the great bound chronicles that recorded the deeds of dead kings. He read the way a man reads who is searching for the shape of his own life hidden among the lines, and slowly, patiently, the story revealed itself to him. The war they called the Dance of the Dragons had not ended in the mutual ruin he half remembered from other tellings, had not consumed the whole of House Targaryen in fire and grief, and left the realm broken for a generation. Instead, the chronicles spoke of a swifter peace, a war that turned at Tumbleton and did not spiral endlessly onward, of a queen named Rhaenyra who had reigned long and steady from the Iron Throne, and of her consort Daemon, who in this telling was not the reckless flame that other men described, but a prince grown wise and restrained, a sword sheathed rather than a fire loosed. Jon read those pages by candlelight until his eyes ached, and he saw in every measured sentence the ghost of a choice he had made, the words he had spoken to a grieving man on a battlefield thick with ash, the counsel that had turned a prince away from vengeance and toward mercy. The realm he had been born into, the realm whose long peace and its later sorrows had shaped every day of his own life, had been quietly bent toward a gentler course by a stranger from the north whose name no chronicle would ever carry. And then, deep in a crumbling account written by a septon whose very name had half faded from the page, he found the detail that stopped his breath and stopped his hand and held him still as stone. A single line, an aside almost, mentioned an unnamed northern captain who had fought at Tumbleton beside the Dragon Prince and who had vanished from all record afterward, spoken of nowhere else in any history that survived, save that Jon now saw plainly how the long peace of his own age, the very world that raised him, had rested all along on that single vanished night. He turned the pages searching for more and found nothing, for the man had been lost from the world's memory almost entirely, saved only by the wandering pen of one chronicler who had thought the detail curious enough to set down and then let slip away. Jon sat back in the wooden chair and felt the weight of it settle over him, the understanding that the histories had come within a single fading line of erasing him utterly, that his mark upon the world was both real and forever invisible, a thing that had shaped a kingdom and would never be believed by any living soul. He carried that knowledge quietly, as he had learned to carry so many things, and in time he climbed the long winding stair to the top of the wall as he had climbed it 1,000 times before. The wind came hard and clean across the ice, and the world spread out below him in every direction, the dark green tangle of the haunted forest to the north, and the pale rolling lands to the south, where the realm he had unknowingly preserved went about its living. Ghost padded up beside him and sat, and the two of them looked out together at the vast and silent country. The dagger rode at his hip, and he rested his hand upon its hilt, and he thought of a battlefield centuries gone, of the beat of dragon wings and the grief in a proud man's eyes, of a war that might have burned the realm to its roots and instead had guttered down to peace because a stranger had been there to speak the words that turned a heart. No one would ever know. No song would carry his name. No chronicle would set him rightly in its pages. No man or woman on the wall or in the great warm halls of the South would believe him if he spoke it aloud. And Jon found, standing there in the cold, with the snow beginning to fall soft and slow around him, that he did not need them to. His place was here, guarding the realm as he had sworn to do, keeping the watch through the long nights. And it was enough to know within himself that once, in an age not his own, he had quietly saved a kingdom's story from its darkest fate, and then had come home. And with that, we finally reached the end of this alternate timeline, and I'd love to hear what you think. Did you enjoy the direction this story took? Was there a moment that surprised you the most? Or a different path you think these characters should have taken? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and many of your ideas inspire future stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Every like and comment helps the channel grow and allows me to keep creating new alternate histories of Westeros for you. Thank you for spending your time here, and I'll see you in the next story. Peace out.